Detective Eliza Stone had seen her fair share of grim cases, but nothing quite like this. The murder of Anna Wells, a local librarian found in her apartment with a knife plunged deep into her chest, felt disturbingly familiar. As Eliza stood over the body, her sharp eyes traced the crime scene, noting the peculiarities that seemed too precise to be a random act of violence. The positioning of the victim's body, the clean, methodical way the knife had been driven in, everything about it screamed calculated, deliberate. It was a signature move. It wasn't just the method that unsettled Eliza. It was the fact that this murder, just like the others in the past week, bore an uncanny resemblance to a series of killings that had rocked the city more than a decade ago. A string of murders attributed to a man named Thomas Drake, who had been convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He was behind bars, locked away, his reign of terror over, until now. The previous murders, 3 in total, had followed the exact same pattern. The victim was always a solitary woman, isolated and vulnerable, killed in a quiet, almost ritualistic manner. The media had dubbed him the Silent Strangler, but it wasn't the strangulation that made the killings so terrifying, it was the chilling precision with which Drake had executed them. His method was so meticulous that the police had initially thought they were dealing with an organized, methodical killer. But after his capture, the killings had stopped. Until now. Eliza had always been haunted by the case of Thomas Drake. She was the one who had arrested him, the one who had built the case from the ground up. She had seen the darkness in his eyes during the trial, heard his cold, emotionless voice as he explained the gruesome details of his crimes. The confession had been undeniable. He had been the one to commit the murders, and the evidence was irrefutable. But now, as Eliza looked down at Anna Wells' lifeless body, doubt crept into her mind. Was it possible that Thomas Drake had an accomplice? A protégé, perhaps, someone who had learned from the master? Or worse, had they made a mistake? Was Drake truly the killer, or had they wrongfully convicted an innocent man? The feeling of unease gnawed at Eliza as she made her way to the precinct. The police had already begun to investigate the scene, but she knew that the case would need her full attention. She needed to understand why these murders were happening again, why someone would go to such lengths to imitate the crimes of a man who was already locked up. As Eliza entered the precinct, her partner, Detective Marcus Reed, was waiting for her. He had been with her through some of the toughest cases in her career, and his presence was always a comfort. "Anything new?" Eliza asked, her voice tense. "Not much," Marcus replied, looking grim. "We've got the usual, no signs of forced entry, no apparent struggle. The same signature wounds, same pattern as the others. But one thing is different this time." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "The victim," Marcus said, flipping through a file. "Anna Wells. She was part of a victim support group. A group that's been active for the last few months. They're all survivors of violent crimes." Eliza's mind raced. "You think the killer is targeting women who've survived attacks? Trying to finish what they started?" "I don't know," Marcus said, his expression troubled. "But it's something we should consider." Eliza leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The implications were terrifying. If this killer was targeting survivors, it meant they were not just trying to kill, they were trying to punish, to finish the job. But why Anna Wells? Why now? The questions seemed endless, and the answers elusive. Over the next few days, Eliza and Marcus dug deeper into the background of the victims. They interviewed friends and family, spoke to neighbors, and pored over the details of each case. But the more they uncovered, the more the case seemed to spiral out of control. None of the women had any apparent connection to each other, except for their involvement in the victim support group. None had ever met Thomas Drake. There were no indications that any of them had ever been in danger before. Yet the killings kept happening. Another woman, a nurse named Lily Harris, was found in her apartment, the same pattern of wounds, the same eerie silence that had accompanied the previous murders. And then another. The city was on edge, and the media was relentless, fueling the fear that a new killer was on the loose, one who had learned from the best. Eliza's thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas Drake. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she had missed, something about the original case that didn't sit right. She had been so sure of his guilt. The evidence had pointed directly to him, DNA, fingerprints, a detailed confession. But now, as she looked at the murders happening again, the doubt crept in. She decided to visit Drake in prison. The prison was a high-security facility, the kind of place where violent offenders were sent to rot. Thomas Drake was kept in solitary confinement, his presence a reminder of the terror he had once unleashed. Eliza had visited him only once, during the trial, and she had seen the coldness in his eyes. But now, as she walked into the sterile visiting room, she felt a strange sense of dread. Drake was sitting at the table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked older, more gaunt than she remembered, but his eyes were still the same, calculating, cold, and devoid of remorse. "Detective Stone," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I was wondering when you'd come." Eliza sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You know why I'm here." Drake smiled, a slow, unsettling grin. "Oh, I have an idea." "You didn't do it," Eliza said, her voice trembling with the words she hadn't allowed herself to say until now. "You didn't kill those women. You didn't kill Anna Wells, or Lily Harris, or any of the others." Drake's smile faltered for a moment, and Eliza saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't quite fear, but something close to it. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe I didn't, Detective. But someone did. And whoever they are, they're better than I ever was. They've learned from me. They know exactly what they're doing." Eliza's heart raced as she stared at him, trying to decipher his words. Had he just confessed? Or was he playing her, trying to plant seeds of doubt in her mind? "You're not fooling me," Eliza said, her voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside her. "You're the one who killed those women. You did it. And you're trying to manipulate me into thinking someone else did." Drake leaned back in his chair, his expression almost sympathetic. "Oh, I'm not trying to manipulate you, Detective. I'm trying to help you. You've missed something. You've been looking in the wrong place. And you're running out of time." Eliza stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "I'm done with your games." As she turned to leave, she heard Drake's voice one last time, low and menacing. "Be careful, Detective. The killer is closer than you think." Over the next few days, Eliza continued to investigate the case, but the feeling of unease continued to haunt her. The murders were escalating, and the pressure was mounting. Every lead seemed to hit a dead end. But then, in a twist of fate, Eliza received a tip from an unlikely source, an informant who claimed to know the identity of the killer. The informant's name was Kelly, a former associate of Drake's who had been involved in the underworld. She had turned on Drake years ago, testifying against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. Kelly had been living in hiding ever since, terrified that Drake would find her. But now, she was willing to talk. Eliza met with Kelly in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Kelly was nervous, glancing over her shoulder as she spoke in hushed tones. "I didn't know who he was at first," Kelly said, her voice shaking. "I thought he was just another guy looking to make a name for himself in the business. But then he started killing. And he was so careful, so precise. It was like he'd learned from the best. From Drake." Eliza's stomach churned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that it wasn't Drake who taught him," Kelly whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It was someone else. Someone even worse. Someone who's been out there, pulling the strings. And now, they've come back to finish what Drake started." The pieces finally clicked into place. The killer wasn't a protege. It wasn't an accomplice. It was someone who had learned from Drake, someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Eliza realized the truth: Thomas Drake hadn't been the mastermind after all. The real killer was someone from his past, a shadowy figure who had been operating behind the scenes, orchestrating the murders from the very beginning. But the question remained, who was this killer, and why had they waited so long to strike? The investigation was far from over. And as Eliza dug deeper into the case, she knew one thing for certain: the true face of evil was yet to be revealed.